I've always cherished the memories of fishing trips with my dad. They were the golden threads woven through my childhood, mornings filled with the smell of dew and the soft, rhythmic splash of oars as we rowed out onto the lake. This trip was supposed to be one of those cherished moments, a final outing before I headed off to college. But it quickly turned into a nightmare that neither of us would ever forget. We arrived at the secluded lake just as the sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the water. The place was perfect, tucked away in the wilderness, far from the distractions of modern life. Dad unloaded the gear while I set up the small rowboat we'd used countless times before. "Ready to catch the big one?" Dad asked, his eyes twinkling with the excitement of the day ahead. "Absolutely," I replied, grinning back at him. We pushed off from the shore, the familiar creak of the oars a comforting sound as we glided over the glassy surface of the lake. For the first couple of hours, everything was perfect. We chatted about my upcoming move, laughed at old jokes, and enjoyed the tranquility that only nature can provide. Dad was in the middle of telling a story about the biggest fish he'd ever caught when we noticed another boat drifting toward us from the far side of the lake. The boat was old and battered, with a single occupant, a man who looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s. He was dressed in dirty, worn-out clothes, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and dark sunglasses. Something about him immediately made me uneasy. "Morning," the man called out, his voice carrying easily over the water. "Mind if I join you? Haven't had much luck on my own." Dad, ever the friendly type, waved him over. "Sure, the more the merrier." The man's boat bumped gently against ours, and he stepped over with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Up close, he looked even more unsettling. His skin was pale and clammy, his smile revealing yellowed teeth. "I'm Frank," he said, extending a hand. Reluctantly, I shook it, noting how cold and clammy his skin felt. "Nice to meet you, Frank. I'm Tom, and this is my son, Alex," Dad introduced us, oblivious to my growing discomfort. For a while, things were awkward but uneventful. Frank was quiet, watching us more than he was fishing. I tried to ignore the prickle of unease, focusing on the calm water and the line in my hand. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Frank said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was too cheerful, too forced. "Yeah," I replied, not meeting his gaze. I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my skin crawl. Then, without warning, Frank reached into his coat and pulled out a large hunting knife, the blade catching the sunlight in a way that made my heart stop. "You know," he said, his tone conversational, "I've always wondered what it would be like to gut a fish, or a person." Dad and I froze, the horror of the situation crashing over us like a wave. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. Frank's eyes gleamed with a predatory excitement as he took a step toward me. "Dad!" I shouted, snapping out of my paralysis. Dad moved faster than I'd ever seen, grabbing the oar and swinging it at Frank. The blow caught him off guard, knocking him off balance, but it didn't take him down. "Get the rope, Alex!" Dad yelled, struggling with Frank as he tried to wrest the knife from his grip. I fumbled for the rope we used to tie up the boat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Dad and Frank were locked in a deadly struggle, the knife flashing dangerously between them. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to loop the rope around Frank's arm, yanking it tight. He howled in pain and rage, his grip on the knife loosening. "Hold him, Alex!" Dad grunted, using the oar to knock the knife into the water. Frank thrashed violently, his strength almost overpowering us. We fought with everything we had, the boat rocking dangerously beneath us. Finally, we managed to subdue him, tying his hands behind his back with the rope. He spat and cursed, struggling against the bonds, but we held firm. Panting and shaken, we sat back, trying to catch our breath. "Let's get to shore and call the police," Dad said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the fear he felt. We rowed back as quickly as we could, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. Frank continued to struggle and shout, but he was securely tied. When we finally reached the shore, Dad stayed with Frank while I ran to the car to grab my phone. The police arrived quickly, taking Frank into custody and questioning us about the events. It turned out he was a wanted criminal, suspected of several violent crimes in the area. The realization that we had narrowly escaped becoming his next victims left us both shaken to the core. That night, as we sat by the campfire, trying to process everything, Dad put a hand on my shoulder. "You did good today, Alex. I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Dad," I replied, still feeling the tremors of fear. "I'm just glad we're okay. We didn't catch any fish that day, but we caught something far more important, a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength we found in each other." The memory of Frank's cold, predatory eyes haunted my dreams for months, but I knew that as long as we had each other, we could face anything. That fishing trip was the last one we ever took. The lake, once a place of peace and joy, now held a darkness that we couldn't shake. But in that darkness, we found a deeper bond, forged in the fires of fear and survival. And that was something that no nightmare could ever take away. It was supposed to be an escape, a brief respite from the pressures of our final semester. We were a tight-knit group of friends: Jake, Lisa, Mark, and me, Emily. We had planned the fishing trip for weeks, eager for a weekend of relaxation at a secluded lake deep in the woods. The first day was everything we hoped it would be. The sun was bright but not too hot, the lake's surface a perfect mirror reflecting the dense forest that surrounded us. We laughed, fished, and told stories late into the night, the campfire casting flickering shadows on our faces. On the second day, we decided to explore the woods around the lake. It was during this hike that Lisa spotted the berries. They were a deep, inviting red, nestled among green foliage. They looked delicious, and despite my hesitation, the others eagerly began to pick and eat them. "Are you sure those are safe?" I asked, watching them with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Jake shrugged, popping a berry into his mouth. "They taste fine. I've seen berries like these before. They're probably just wild raspberries." Mark grinned, his teeth stained red from the juice. "Come on, Emily, live a little." Against my better judgment, I plucked a berry from the bush and tasted it. It was sweet, with a slightly bitter aftertaste. I figured they were right, what harm could a few berries do? We returned to our campsite, the day passing in a haze of fishing and swimming. It wasn't until dusk that the first signs of trouble appeared. Lisa was the first to mention it. "Does anyone else feel weird?" she asked, her voice distant and unfocused. Jake and Mark exchanged uneasy glances. "Yeah," Jake admitted. "I feel like everything's shifting." A creeping sense of unease settled over me. The forest around us seemed to pulse and breathe, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. Shadows lengthened and deepened, and the air grew thick and oppressive. "We need to stay calm," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe it's just the berries messing with us." But it was too late. The hallucinations took hold, warping reality into a nightmarish landscape. The campfire's glow became a sinister, flickering light, casting monstrous shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Mark started laughing hysterically, clutching his head. "This is just a trip, right? Just a bad trip. We'll be fine." But his laughter turned to screams, raw and primal, as he fell to the ground, writhing in terror. Lisa backed away, her eyes wide with fear, her skin pale and clammy. Jake tried to reach out to her, but his movements were slow and distorted, as if he were moving through water. "Stay together," I shouted, my voice breaking. "We need to stay together." Suddenly, Jake let out a guttural roar, his face contorted with rage. He lunged at Mark, his hands closing around his friend's throat. Mark's screams were cut off abruptly as he struggled against Jake's grip, his eyes bulging in terror. "Jake, stop. I screamed, rushing to pull him off. But he was strong, too strong. It was like he had tapped into some primal, savage strength. Lisa stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth, unable to process what was happening. I grabbed a branch from the ground and struck Jake across the back. He howled in pain and turned on me, his eyes wild and unrecognizable. "Emily, run!" Mark gasped, his voice barely a whisper. I hesitated, torn between helping Mark and saving myself. But Jake's crazed expression made the decision for me. I turned and fled into the woods, the branches scratching at my skin as I stumbled through the underbrush. Behind me, I could hear Jake's heavy footsteps, his enraged shouts echoing through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows twisting and merging into grotesque forms. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing at the base of a large tree, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallucinations intensified, the trees around me warping into monstrous figures. I could hear whispers, soft and insidious, seeping into my mind. "He'll find you," they seemed to say. "You can't escape." I clutched my head, trying to block out the voices, but they grew louder, more insistent. I could see Jake in the shadows, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. He was hunting me, driven by a madness I couldn't comprehend. In the distance, I heard Lisa's scream, sharp and piercing. My heart ached, but I knew I couldn't go back. I had to survive. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, time had lost all meaning. The whispers became a cacophony, the shadows pressing in on me. I felt like I was drowning in fear and despair. Just when I thought I couldn't endure any longer, I heard a voice, clear and strong, cutting through the madness. "Emily. Emily, where are you?" It was Mark. Somehow, he had survived. I pushed myself up, my legs trembling, and stumbled towards the sound of his voice. I found him near the edge of the lake, bloodied and bruised but alive. Lisa was with him, her eyes hollow with trauma. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice urgent. "Jake, he's lost it. We have to go." We helped each other to the boat, our movements slow and clumsy. As we rowed away from the shore, the hallucinations began to fade, reality slowly reasserting itself. But the horror of what we had experienced lingered, a dark cloud that would never fully dissipate. We reported the incident to the authorities, but they found no trace of Jake. The berries were identified as a rare hallucinogenic plant, the effects of which were unpredictable and often dangerous. The memory of that night haunts me still. The sound of Jake's laughter, the look in his eyes as he turned on us, those images are seared into my mind. We lost more than just a friend that night, we lost a part of ourselves, a piece of our innocence that we can never reclaim. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind whispers through the trees, I think I can still hear him, out there in the darkness, waiting. The old fishing boat, the Isabella, was a legend in our coastal town. 20 years ago, it had vanished without a trace, along with its crew of 6 seasoned fishermen. They had set out on a calm autumn morning, the sea tranquil under a clear sky, and were never seen again. Theories ranged from piracy to rogue waves to the supernatural, but the sea kept its secrets, and the Isabella became a ghost story whispered among the fishermen. I had heard the tale countless times growing up. My father was a fisherman, as was his father before him. The sea was in our blood, its call impossible to ignore. So, when I inherited the family fishing business, I accepted the risks that came with it. The sea could be cruel, but it was home. It was on a particularly foggy morning when I found it. I had set out alone, planning to check some crab pots we had laid near the edge of the fishing grounds. The fog was thick, the kind that wraps around you and muffles sound, turning the world into a muted gray. As I navigated through the mist, I saw it, a dark shape looming ahead. At first, I thought it was a rock or perhaps another boat. But as I drew closer, my heart began to race. The name on the bow was clear despite the barnacles and seaweed that clung to the hull, Isabella. I tied my boat alongside it, my hands trembling. The Isabella looked ancient, as if it had aged centuries in its 20-year absence. The wood was rotten in places, the paint peeling and faded. There was an eerie silence about it, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. With a deep breath, I climbed aboard, my boots thudding softly on the weathered deck. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay. The cabin door hung ajar, creaking on its hinges as I pushed it open. Inside, the scene was frozen in time. Nets and fishing gear were strewn about, and a table was set for a meal that had never been eaten. Plates and cups were covered in a fine layer of dust, as if untouched by the passing years. But it was the logbook on the captain's desk that drew me. My fingers left prints in the dust as I picked it up and opened it. The entries were normal at first, notes about the weather, the catch, the usual business of fishing. But then they grew strange. September 15, 2001, the sea is behaving oddly. Waves are calm, but there's something beneath the surface. Something watching. September 16, 2001, the crew is on edge. Jim swears he saw something in the water last night. A face, he said. Laughed it off, but I saw it too. September 17, 2001, the fog has set in. Can't see more than a few feet. Something is out there. We hear whispers, but no one's around. The entry stopped abruptly after that. The last page was smeared with something dark, and the writing was barely legible, "It's here. God help us." A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly shut the book. The cabin felt oppressive, the air thick and hard to breathe. I needed to get out. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint whispering, like the sound of many voices carried on the wind. It seemed to come from below deck. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, descending the narrow staircase into the hold. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed to press in on me. My flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, revealing old crates and barrels, their contents long spoiled. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I followed it to a door at the far end of the hold. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, the metal cold under my fingers. The door creaked open, and the smell hit me, a stench of rot and seawater. Inside, the room was small, lined with wooden shelves. And there, in the middle of the floor, were the remains of the crew. Their bones were scattered, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The whispering rose to a crescendo, and I realized it was coming from them. Their voices, trapped in an eternal loop of fear and agony. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The boat began to creak and groan, the wood protesting under some unseen force. I had to get out, had to escape. I turned and fled, racing up the stairs and across the deck. The fog seemed to close in around me, thick and suffocating. As I leaped back onto my boat, I glanced back at the Isabella. Through the mist, I saw them, ghostly figures, their faces twisted with sorrow and rage, reaching out towards me. I gunned the engine and sped away, the whispers fading into the distance. When I reached the harbor, I was shaking, my mind a whirl of fear and disbelief. I told my story to the authorities, but they found nothing. The Isabella was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. The sea had given up one of its secrets, only to swallow it again. And the Isabella, with its crew of lost souls, remained a dark legend, a warning of the horrors that lie beneath the surface, waiting to pull you down into the depths.